Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Beneficent. Yang berhormat Tuan Haji Muhammad bin Sabu, Menteri Pertahanan, yang amat berhormat Tuan Amiruddin bin Syahri, Menteri Besar Selangor, Dr. Mong Zarni, Forces of Renewal Southeast Asia, co-founder and Secretary General, Hishamuddin Rais, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to the organizers, FORSEA Kuala Lumpur, for this invitation to celebrate democracy in Malaysia. We in Malaysia aspire to be democratic, but we must also know that democracy is not a perfect system. It has many weaknesses, and these weaknesses can be exploited. Democracy arises from the failure of previous systems of government, the absolute monarchs and the dictators. They fail to meet the needs of the people, and the people decided that there should be a change in the system of government, and they conceived the idea that they, the people, should rule the country. It's a great idea. The people should rule themselves. But it is physically impossible, simply because their numbers are so big that they cannot congregate in order to discuss anything, and certainly they cannot reach any acceptable conclusion. And therefore, if they try to practice ruling by themselves, there is going to be chaos, and they will have no benefit from the change of the system. So it was decided that it is democratic if we give power to a certain number of people to represent us and to speak on our own behalf. But who should we choose? And there came the idea that people should divide themselves into political parties based on ideology. This is fine, but as you know, democracy is open to abuses, and a lot of abuses will actually deny democracy. For example, it is entirely possible for the force to be used in a democratic process. Sometimes democracy is interpreted only as democracy within the country, but not between countries. And so today we find very, very democratic countries forcing other countries to accept democracy on pain of death and destruction. If you don't become democratic, we will kill you, we will murder you, we will destroy your country. And if we ask ourselves, is that a very democratic attitude to take? Certainly it's not worthy of a country that professes to be democratic. But this is happening today, even more so. And as Haji Ahmad Sabu mentioned just now, a democratic country can actually change the government of another country without need for elections or whatever, but merely by the strength of that country, the power of that country, and the offer of aid if you behave yourself. That is certainly not democratic. And the greatest institution in the world today, the United Nations, is the least democratic of all the institutions in this world. five countries can deny the right of 190 other countries. If one of these five says no, then that will be the decision of the United Nations. It is totally undemocratic. And these five countries refuse to accept any other system except that which gives them dictatorial powers over the whole world. So when these people talk about democracy, they are really insincere and perhaps cynical, insisting that countries should become democratic when they themselves are not democratic. That is why I say that democracy is not a perfect system. It is almost impossible to implement democracy if it is translated to mean rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It just cannot happen. We have chosen something close to that by assuming that the majority should rule. The majority should have the right to rule over the minority. But because we are concerned about the minority, we have certain protection given to the minority. But is it fair? In a country of 100 million people, 51% will rule over the people who are against them, the 49% who did not support the government. Somehow or other, the voice of the 49% must also be heard, must also be considered. This is the problem with democracy, that actually democracy is unimplementable as originally defined. We need to find some way of ensuring that even the losers will gain something. And so we devise the rule of law. The law is equal for everyone. Unfortunately, in most countries, certain people are exempted from the implementation of the law. They can do whatever they like, and no action would be taken against them because they are privileged. They are holding certain position or have held certain position. So again, even the rule of law cannot bring about true democracy. Nevertheless, the rule of law contributes towards the democratic process. Without the rule of law, there will be no semblance of democracy at all. Now, democracy is a system of government. Initially, of course, when people became gregarious, like to live together, it became necessary that their relationship with each other must follow certain procedures, or else there would be conflicts and violence within the society that they have built up. And so initially, the strongest of them would become the leader, simply because he is strong and he is able to enforce his will on whoever goes against the practice of that society. Now, the practice of that society follows a certain form which we see in all societies. All societies have customs. In Malay, it is adat, a rule that is accepted by all but is not institutionalized. We obey our adat because in the absence of law and order, it is the adat that governs our relation within society. But of course, adat is not strong enough because it has no legal authority, and eventually Adat was converted to the rule of law, and this is an improvement on the implementation of governance within a community. We are seeing today the acceptance of democracy all over the world. This acceptance is really because the most powerful nations in the world claim to be democratic. Actually, they are not very democratic, but they are practicing a certain form of governance that is quite close to that of the ideal of the people ruling themselves in any society. But because these powers are democratic, they assume it is their duty to democratize the whole world. The world must now become democratic. Even if you have a ruler who is sympathetic, who looks after his people, who is well liked by his people, but if he is not democratic, then he is not acceptable, the system is not acceptable. More than that, we now see that democracies, after upholding human rights and the things that are supposed to be associated with democracy, they are now using force to ensure that others will become democratic as well. And so we see what happened in Iraq. Because Iraq was not democratic, the democracies have gone to war with Iraq, believing that within 3 months, Iraq would accept democracy and become a democratic nation. It is now more than almost 9 years, and still Iraq is not the kind of democracy that we want to see. But because of the process applied, we see the destruction of many countries. Millions were killed in order to promote democracy. That means that the Democrats do not really believe in the equality and the rights of men. If they believe in the rights of men, of the human being, they would not inflict such damage on the people of Iraq simply because they have no means of becoming democratic. We are seeing today all over the world many imperfections in a democracy. In Malaysia, we elected a government fully believing that the elected government will serve the people. But once power is attained by the winners, they decided that the power is for themselves, to enrich themselves, to oppress the people. And for years, they oppressed the people. There was no way to overthrow them. But fortunately for us, an election was held and the people exercised their power to negate the rights of the party that has governed this country for 61 years. They have decided that now is the time for the opposition to take over power. And the opposition have made promises, lots of promises. Now the nation is watching this opposition government implement those promises. And unfortunately, they find themselves quite unable to implement many of their promises. And so begins the next round of running down the government. This government, if it stays long enough, will behave just like the previous government. It begins to be against the people, and it finds that criticisms level at it is not acceptable. And then from the fear of losing power, they will employ other means in order to retain power. And so the cycle goes on. We see this throughout the nations of the world, the rise of democracy everywhere, the abuses in the democratic government, the lack of principle that is shown by democratic government, the deterioration in their understanding and implementation of democracy, and eventually they will become a government that is not truly democratic. This happens to all systems, even for religion. All religions are meant for the good, but over the years, interpreters put other forces, put other conditions for the religion, interpretation which often are against the teachings of the religion itself, but because they have certain authority, certain influence, certain power, their interpretation is accepted. That is why in Malaysia today you see a person who was once condemned as a dictator, as Mahazalim, Mahafiraun, and all that, being accepted by the very people who leveled these epithets at him, accepting him as a leader. And for the leader also, it is very difficult for him to sit and be with the very people who used to run him down. So it is a two-way thing. It is not just about Ahmad Sabu accepting me, but it's also about me accepting Ahmad Sabu. Well, this is the way of the world. We have to be loyal, not to institutions, but to the objective of the institution. The previous party was formed in order to gain independence for this country and to develop this country. But over the years, it forgets about its original purpose and begins to abuse the powers given to that party. At that stage, it is wrong to support the party. It is right to support the struggle of the party. But if the party no longer makes the struggle, it is important that you should not support the party. You should leave, and on leaving you should be big-hearted enough to work with other people who are against that party. And so the choice is either you remain absolutely loyal to the party, or you remain absolutely loyal to the struggle of the party. Once the party deviates from the struggle, it is important that you remain loyal to the struggle to the point of leaving the party and even fighting against the party. I believe that if we stay with the struggle, we stay with the need for reforms, the need for changes, and that should be our objective all the time. And once the party that we are members of deviates from that, it is important that the party should be left out, or you should leave the party and work in the opposite direction, but in order to achieve the same objective that you involve yourself in at the very beginning when the party was formed. So what is important is not the party which is struggling for its perpetuation, but what is important is the struggle of the party. All parties are created in order to carry out certain reforms. Once that party refuses or neglects those reforms, it is time for the people who support the party to leave the party, but to struggle on with the reforms that should be done from the very beginning. So democracy in Malaysia has, to a certain extent, succeeded. We see a change of government taking place. And the change of government took place as a result of the democratic process of an election. Normally, those in power will try to retain their position despite all the objections to them. They will do all kinds of things which are wrong, which are crooked. They have done this, but unfortunately for them, it has not succeeded. And so the transition from the old 61-year-old government to this government has been achieved without violence. There was no fight. There was no destruction of this country, no civil wars, no wars of any kind. Instead, by a dint of the strong support for the opposition, the incumbent government had to accept that they have lost. And they also knew that if they start any violence to defend themselves, they would lose in the end. That is the situation which persuaded them eventually to give up without a struggle. And this country achieved a switch in the governance of this country without violence after a proper election, or almost a proper election, was held. To that extent, Malaysia is democratic. But now comes a time for the winners to stay with their promises. And this is not going to be easy, partly because the situation that is left to them by the previous government is so bad that making corrective action becomes extremely difficult. But the people, of course, are not patient. They want to see change now. But whether they like it or not, they will have to bear with us. They will have to bear with the present government, because it takes time to correct all the wrongs that has been done by the previous government. So democracy is by far the best system of governance known to man today. No other system has been able to bring about a relative peace during changes that take place. But it requires a mindset, a culture that is willing to accept changes taking place merely by the stroke of a pen. In the past, when there were authoritarian governments, changes could only take place through a revolution, a violent revolution, a civil war, and all kinds of other violence which may destroy the country before an authoritarian government can be overthrown. But in the democratic process, the mere stroke of a pen can result in a change of government. Therefore, democracy, despite all its imperfection, is still the best system of governance that human beings have been able to devise since the beginning of time. Thank you.